In this video, we'll start to build out our profile component and make some additional changes throughout the application so that it functions a lot better. Now, remember from the GraphQL videos that we created a me context that essentially holds information about the person that is currently logged in. So we'll need to make sure that we make that query for me and get back things like the ID, the name, the username, and the card details that that particular user has, and then make that available in the profile. Now, how could we do that? Well, we just learned a little bit about higher order components, and the answer is that we need to create our own higher order component that is going to take that session information and enhance the profile component with the me session coming from GraphQL. Now, this is probably the most important concept to understand, and if you understand it, then you won't have any problems understanding the remainder of this video. So remember, we created this active session component, and we're going to write some code for this now. So this is going to be our own higher order component. So I'm going to bring in React from React, import the query from React Apollo, and also import GQL from GraphQL tag. So I'm going to create a query using this syntax, and I'm going to query for me, and let's return the ID, the name, the username, the car, the ID, the make, and the model of that car. So this is a standard me query that we've seen in earlier videos. But what is going to be different this time is that we're going to create an enhanced component. So I'm going to call this active session, and the active session will accept a single parameter. So this is a function that accepts a single parameter of a component. And it will take the props, and what we will do is have our query component to execute the query, and in between here I'm going to extract the data and the refetch from GraphQL, and what I'm going to return is the enhanced component. So I'm going to return a component that will have the properties of the original component that we pass in, plus it will have a session that is going to be the data itself. And what is going to be data? Data is going to be the result of this query, and I will also pass in the refetch attribute. So refetch is equal to a refetch. Okay, so query is closed, and then we're going to export default active session. The refetch attribute that we added will allow us to reload the query in response to a user's action. So for example, if a user clicks a button, for example, then we could trigger this refetch attribute, and we're going to essentially refresh the result of this query. So this is also a very important concept. So we have this active session available for us. So what that means is that we can now enhance our profile component, make this a higher order component. So call active session here, and just make sure that it's auto imported. Okay, so that's imported. So active session is available in the profile page. The result of this creation of this enhanced component is going to be that we will have access to both the session and the refetch in every component that we apply active session to. So what that means is that I can now access the session in here. So let's actually extract only the session, and I can pass that on to my profile. And because I pass that on to my profile component that I'm essentially building up here, I can now say hello again and say this.props me.session, so that's the session property, that will contain the result of the me query. So I can do me.name. And in fact, let me just do a console.log this.props.session for you so that you can see this. So let's save this. And in fact, let's go back to the console right here now. So you can see that we do get an empty value in here. So there's still some work that we need to do, but at least we get the session information as an object that's currently empty. Okay, so even better, as opposed to just rendering the profile component, would be to say if session exists and session.me exists, then show us the profile itself. Otherwise, don't show anything. So let's log in now. Make sure I actually delete this token. So let's log in. And as you can see, we're not saying anything because this session does not work that well. So there are multiple reasons why this is. And we need to do a few changes in our React app, but we also need to go back to our GraphQL instance or GraphQL application and make a few changes there. So first of all, we need to go back to login and make sure that we add something here. So what we need to do for our login is also access the refetch instance. So we need to go back to login and we need to add some action here. So it's not enough to just store the token and push the user to the profile. We are missing a crucial step in here, and that is to run the refetch. Because once we set the token, we want to make sure that we refetch the information to actually set up the session itself, because we saw earlier that the session is an empty object. So why do we get an empty session, an empty me object right here? Well, remember when we went through the GraphQL videos, we had to create a context. So if you remember, and I have this open right here, we had to get the logged in user and set up this context here for our Apollo server. So in the same way, we need to do the same now for our React application as well. So we need to go back to index.js because this is the place where we created our Apollo client. And we need to make some additional changes to the options. So if there's a request, this should be an asynchronous operation. So there's an operation happening for the request. We will make sure that we capture the token and we will await local storage.getItem. So that is what allows us to get something from local storage. So that's the getItem function. And if we say if the token is available, then we're going to set the context of our Apollo client's operation, and we're going to send the XAuth token header with the value of the token itself. So this will make sure that every time when we do an operation that requires us to pass in a token to our GraphQL instance, it passes the XAuth token header along with that request. And we could do something else. If there's no token, you could do something else. So we could say operation.setContext and add some options to that context as well. Okay, so let's save this and let's see what happens now if we try to log in as a user. And now, because we've added this, the operation has now access to this header. It passes the header to the GraphQL endpoint, which then comes back with a populated me object. And as you can see, we have this props session me.name printed in our profile. So the next thing that I'll do is copy some code to also see the list of cars for this particular user. So we say if this.props.session.me.car length is not equal to 0, then we will iterate through the cars and list them. Otherwise, we just say no car. So let's hit save. And now we get access to that car information as well. I'm only extracting the make and the model, but not the color. Okay, perfect. So what we have achieved is a login functionality. Now there are a few more things that we need to fix here, because if you notice, the login and register menu items are still invisible. And that's not really what we want, because what we want is have access to this session and provide different navigation items for the users, right? So we want to make sure that they have a link to the profile, for example. So let's open navigation.js and put this functionality together. So navigation with auth should return, what should it return? Well, it should return something similar to this. So let's just copy that. And instead of link to login, we'll say link to profile, and this should just say profile. And we'll have a logout functionality as well, but we don't need that for now. Okay, so how can we make sure that we actually see this navigation? Well, think about it. Where do we use this navigation? We use that in app.js, right? This is exactly where we have that. So what we should do is pass in the session object to the navigation, and then we could say if there's a session, then display navigation with auth, otherwise display what we see at the moment, the login and register menu items. But how do we do that? Well, we already have a component called active session, which allows us to enhance an existing component, and app is an existing component. So what we can do, we can call active session on app, which will mean that this app component will have access to the session, and we can pass that as a property to the navigation component. So we say this.props.session, we can save this, and now in our navigation component we can extract this session information in here, and we can say if there's a session and session.me exists, then show navigation with authentication, otherwise show no authentication. So save this and look here. Now we have the profile, and if we now delete this token just manually and refresh this page, we now get login and register. Now there are a few things here. What happens if we go to profile? Well, if we go to profile, we get a blank page because we're not rendering anything. But under ideal circumstances, we should be redirected to the login page. And what happens if we log in? Okay, so now when we log in, we get a blank page, even though we have a token. But if we refresh, now we get the updated navigation and the profile itself. And what happens when we go to login? Well, we see the login page, but it doesn't make sense because we should really be seeing the profile. There's no need to log in again because we're already logged in. So there are a few more things that we need to fix, and we'll get to those in the next video.